lonely rancher spent another Christmas alone, until an Apache woman whispered, "Please marry me." John Thompson had spent nearly 50 winters on his ranch, and each year Christmas had grown quieter than the last. The cabin he lived in was modest, with wooden walls that creaked and groaned under the weight of the cold New Mexico winter. Outside, the snow blanketed the land in pure white, stretching for miles until it met the distant mountains. Inside, the fire crackled in the stone fireplace, filling the small room with warmth and a soft flickering glow. Yet, despite the comforting fire, John felt the sharp ache of loneliness. This was the third Christmas in a row that he would spend alone. His children had grown, married, and moved far away to cities where life moved faster, and holidays were crowded with family and friends. Invitations to join them had arrived months ago, but John had declined, insisting that he could manage. The truth, however, was that the thought of leaving his ranch, the land he had worked for decades, felt impossible. And so he stayed, wrapped in silence and the faint scent of pine from the logs burning in the hearth. The cabin was neat and orderly. John kept everything in its place the way he had always liked it. His boots were lined up by the door, his tools hung precisely on the wall, and the simple wooden table in the center of the room bore the marks of countless meals eaten alone. He had tried to make small gestures to lift the holiday spirit, a wreath on the door, a candle on the windowsill, but the emptiness in the house swallowed the cheer. He poured himself a cup of strong coffee and sat in his favorite chair, staring at the empty space across from him, imagining the laughter and warmth that used to fill that spot. Outside, the wind whistled through the trees, bending the branches under the weight of snow. The sound was mournful, a lonely song that mirrored his own thoughts. John loved the land deeply, the cattle, the wide-open plains, the rhythm of the seasons, but there was a part of him that longed for companionship. He had been married once, many years ago, but that chapter of his life ended too soon. His wife had passed away after a long illness, leaving him alone with the ranch and a heart that had learned to endure more than it wished. Since then, he had thrown himself into work, tending to the animals and the land, keeping busy to fill the silence. But in moments like this, when the cold pressed in and the world seemed hushed, he felt the weight of loneliness more keenly than ever. As he stirred his coffee, John glanced at the little Christmas tree he had set up in the corner. It was small and simple, decorated with a few handmade ornaments and some twinkling lights. The sight brought a faint smile to his face. He remembered decorating the tree with his children when they were young, their laughter echoing off the walls, their hands sticky with glue and glitter. Now the ornaments sat silently, a quiet reminder of what had been and what was missing. He shook his head and took a sip of his coffee, trying to push the memories aside. The ranch itself was beautiful in the winter, even if it felt empty without the sound of family around. Snow covered the fields in soft blankets, and the cattle huddled together for warmth, their breath rising in the cold air. John put on his heavy coat, wrapped a scarf around his neck, and stepped outside. The crisp air bit at his cheeks, and the snow crunched under his boots. He walked among the cattle, checking on them, making sure they had enough hay. The routine was comforting, a familiar rhythm that made the loneliness a little easier to bear. Still, as he paused by the fence and looked out across the snowy landscape, a sense of melancholy settled over him. He had friends in the nearby town, neighbors who occasionally stopped by to check on him or share a meal, but even these visits were rare. Most people were busy with their own lives, their own families. John had grown used to solitude, but some nights, especially on Christmas, it pressed down on him like a heavy blanket he could not shake off. He returned to the cabin as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The fire had burned low, leaving only glowing embers. John added more logs and settled back into his chair, rubbing his hands together to warm them. He thought about the years that had passed, the changes he had seen, and the quiet life he now led. There was a kind of peace in it, yes, but also a deep, aching loneliness. To distract himself, he pulled out an old photo album from a shelf. The pages were worn, and the corners of the photos were curled with age. He flipped through images of his children as babies, his late wife smiling brightly, family gatherings, birthdays, and Christmases long ago. Each photo told a story, a memory of love and connection that now seemed distant. He traced his fingers over the faces in the pictures, feeling both joy and sorrow. The past was comforting, but it also reminded him of what he missed. Dinner that night was simple: a baked potato, a small piece of meat, and some bread. He ate slowly, savoring the flavors, but the meal felt incomplete without someone to share it with. Afterward, he washed the dishes, humming a quiet tune he remembered from his childhood. The cabin grew darker as the night deepened, and the only sounds were the wind outside, the crackle of the fire, and the distant call of an owl. John sat back in his chair, staring at the empty space across from him. wondering if next year would be any different. He thought about the possibility of companionship, of someone to share his life in this land with. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine a life where the cabin was filled with laughter again, where conversations and warmth returned, but the thought quickly faded, replaced by the reality of the quiet room, the single cup of coffee, and the stillness of Christmas Eve. As he prepared to go to bed, John looked out the window one last time. The snow sparkled under the moonlight, the stars twinkling in the clear sky. There was beauty in the solitude, a quiet majesty that he had grown to appreciate. Yet beneath it all, there was a longing he could not ignore, a hope, however small, that life might still hold surprises. With a sigh, he blew out the candle on the windowsill, the soft flicker disappearing into the darkness. He crawled into bed, pulling the warm quilt close, and closed his eyes. The wind howled outside, and the snow continued to fall, covering the world in white. John Thompson, the lonely rancher, drifted into sleep, unaware that this Christmas might be unlike any other, and that the quiet of his life was about to be touched by something, or someone he had never expected. The morning after Christmas, John woke to the soft sound of snow falling against the roof. The ranch was quiet, almost eerily so, with only the occasional crackle of a branch bending under the weight of the snow. He had grown used to the silence over the years, but today it felt different, more complete, more pressing, almost as if the land itself was waiting. He dressed quickly, pulling on his thick coat, sturdy boots, and a woolen hat. Outside the cold was sharp, but the air smelled clean and fresh, carrying the faint scent of pine and snow. John began his usual rounds, checking the fences and making sure the cattle had enough food and water. The animals huddled close to the barn for warmth, and he moved among them, speaking softly, patting their heads, reassuring them with the calm confidence he had developed over decades of ranching. He loved this land and these animals. They were a constant in a life that sometimes felt too empty. Yet, even as he worked, there was a small part of him that noticed a change, a feeling in the air he couldn't quite name. It was just as he approached the northern fence that he saw her. At first she was only a silhouette against the white landscape, a lone figure riding a horse through the snow. But as she drew closer, he could see her clearly, a woman moving gracefully despite the cold, her long dark hair peeking from beneath a warm hooded cloak. There was a confidence in her posture, an ease with the land that made her seem both part of the wilderness and apart from it. She stopped at the gate, her horse's hooves crunching in the snow. John instinctively tightened his grip on the fence, unsure what to expect. "Good morning," she called out, her voice soft but firm, carrying across the snow-covered field. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." John stepped closer, squinting at her face. It was striking, with warm brown eyes that seemed to look right through him, a gentle smile, and a calmness that immediately put him on edge, and yet made him curious. "You're not disturbing me," he said cautiously. "I wasn't expecting anyone today. What brings you here?" "I'm Naeli," she said, dismounting from her horse with practiced ease. "I'm new to the area and looking for work, maybe a place to stay for a while. I heard this ranch might be hiring." There was honesty in her words, but also a quiet confidence that suggested she was no stranger to hard work. John hesitated, unsure how to respond. It had been years since someone had come to the ranch for anything other than supplies or a casual visit. His instincts told him to be wary, but something about her presence felt different. "Well, it's just me here," he said finally, gesturing to the cabin. "It's quiet. Hard work, long hours, and not much company." "I like quiet," Naeli replied, glancing around at the snowy fields, the fences, the distant mountains. I'm used to it. I can work hard and keep to myself. I only ask for a roof over my head and a chance to help." There was a pause, filled only by the soft wind. John studied her, looking into her eyes, trying to gauge whether she was serious. There was something genuine in her demeanor, a calm strength that reminded him of his late wife, not in appearance, but in spirit. After a long moment, he nodded. "All right," he said. "You can stay. We can talk more inside. It's warm there." Inside the cabin, the air was rich with the scent of wood smoke and the faint lingering aroma of coffee. John offered her a seat by the fire and poured her a cup of hot tea, which she accepted with a quiet nod. The firelight danced across her face, highlighting the warmth and kindness in her eyes. They sat for a while, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. "So, you're from around here?" John asked after a moment, breaking the silence. "I was born near the mountains, not far from here," Naeli said. "I've traveled a lot, learning about people, plants, and the land. I help where I can and try to learn something new every day." The winter here is beautiful, even if it is harsh. John nodded, intrigued by her words. You know your way around the land? Yes, she said with a quiet smile. I can handle animals, help with chores, cook, even mend fences. I've done a lot of work with families like yours before. I like being useful, and I like seeing things done well. There was a sincerity in her tone that John couldn't ignore. He realized slowly that her presence brought a warmth to the cabin, not just from the fire, but from the way she moved, spoke, and listened. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel completely empty. Over the next several days, Nayeli became a part of the ranch in ways John hadn't expected. She helped him repair fences damaged by the winter storms, tended to the cattle when the snow was deep, and even prepared simple, hearty meals. She had a quiet humor that made him laugh more than he had in years, and she told stories of her childhood, of the land, and of her people with a sense of wonder and respect. John found himself looking forward to her presence. The sound of her voice while they worked, the way she noticed things he had overlooked, and the calm confidence she brought made the ranch feel alive in a way it hadn't for decades. There were moments when he caught himself staring, realizing how much he enjoyed her company. He had almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone to talk to, someone who understood the rhythm of life on the ranch, someone whose eyes held curiosity and kindness. One evening, after a long day of chores, they sat by the fire sharing a simple meal of stew and bread. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the windows and bending the trees under the snow. Nayeli spoke softly about her family and the traditions she cherished, and John listened, fascinated by the richness of her world. He told her stories, too, of his childhood, his wife, his children, and the ranch itself. For the first time in years, he felt the loneliness that had haunted him begin to lift, replaced by something lighter, connection. Life here can be hard, Nayeli said at one point, her voice barely above a whisper, but it's beautiful, too. The land, the animals, even the snow, it teaches patience and care. You're strong to do this all alone. John looked into her eyes and realized that he had been alone, not just in the physical sense, but in heart and spirit. Her presence, gentle and steady, was a reminder that companionship could exist even in the most isolated places. I've managed, he said quietly, but it's better now, with you here. The days that followed were filled with work, laughter, and shared stories. John showed her the best spots to feed the cattle, the hidden trails in the snow, and the beauty of the land in winter light. Nayeli shared her knowledge of herbs, natural remedies, and survival skills that John had never learned, adding new depth to his daily life. They began to trust one another, and in that trust a subtle bond began to form, a connection neither of them had expected but both felt deeply. One particularly cold morning, Nayeli helped John repair a section of the fence that had been damaged by a fallen branch. They worked side by side, hands numb but hearts warm with shared effort. When they paused to rest, she handed him a steaming cup of tea. He accepted it gratefully, and as they stood there in the snow, the wind carrying the distant cries of cattle, John felt a sense of peace he hadn't known for years. For the first time in decades, Christmas didn't feel empty. It wasn't the gifts or the decorations that mattered. It was the presence of another soul who cared, who understood, and who shared the quiet beauty of the ranch with him. Nayeli had brought warmth, laughter, and life into a cabin that had been too quiet for too long. As night fell, John sat in his chair by the fire, Nayeli knitting quietly beside him. He watched her, realizing that his loneliness had begun to fade. The wind outside seemed less harsh, the snow less isolating. The ranch, his home, and even Christmas itself had taken on a new meaning, one of connection, companionship, and hope. And though he didn't yet know what the future held, John Thompson felt a small spark of something he had not felt in a long time, the possibility that life, even in its quietest corners, could still surprise him. The weeks after Nayeli's arrival passed like the slow, steady rhythm of the seasons. The snow began to melt in patches across the ranch, revealing the brown earth beneath and the first hints of green pushing through. John and Nayeli had settled into a routine, one that brought a comfort neither of them had expected. Each morning, they would rise before the sun, tend to the cattle, repair fences, or check the barns. By evening, they would return to the cabin, sharing a simple meal by the fire, speaking softly of the day's events. For John, life had never been so peaceful. The silence that had once pressed against him like a heavy weight had transformed into something lighter, a quiet that allowed room for laughter and conversation. Nayeli had a way of noticing things he often overlooked, the soft sound of a calf's whine, the subtle changes in the weather, even the small cracks in the cabin walls that needed mending. She worked tirelessly, never complaining, yet never letting the work feel like a burden. Her presence had a rhythm of its own, blending naturally with the life he had built over decades. One crisp morning, John was stacking hay in the barn when Nayeli appeared beside him, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "I thought you might need a warm drink," she said, handing him one. Her hands were warm and steady, and the scent of her herbal soap lingered faintly in the air. John took the mug gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. "You always know just what's needed," he said with a smile. She shrugged, her eyes twinkling. "I pay attention," she replied simply. As they worked side by side, the conversation flowed easily. Nayeli told him about her family and childhood, about lessons she had learned from her elders and the skills passed down through generations. John, in turn, shared stories of his own life, the challenges of running the ranch, the memories of his late wife, and the dreams he had once held for his children. He spoke openly, something he hadn't done in years, and she listened with genuine interest, asking questions and offering gentle observations. Their bond grew with each passing day. It was not sudden or dramatic, but quiet and steady, like the slow thawing of the winter snow. John found himself anticipating her laughter, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about something she loved, the warmth of her presence by the fire after a long day. Nayeli, too, seemed to settle into the ranch and into his life with ease, her laughter echoing through the cabin in the fields, bringing life to corners of the home that had long been silent. One afternoon, John showed Nayeli a hidden trail that led to a small grove of pine trees near the edge of the property. The snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of moss and fallen needles. "I come here when I need to think," John said, pausing to look around. The grove was quiet, the only sound the distant call of a bird and the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. Nayeli smiled, her breath forming tiny clouds in the cold air. "It's beautiful," she said. "I can see why you come here." They walked slowly along the trail, their conversation drifting from practical matters, how to repair a fence, which herbs could help the cattle, to more personal reflections. John spoke of his fears of being alone forever, of the emptiness he had carried in his heart since losing his wife. Nayeli listened without judgment, her presence a steady, comforting force. She shared her own experiences, too, the moments of loneliness she had faced while traveling, the resilience she had learned from her family and culture, and the quiet joys she had found in small acts of care. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink, they reached a clearing where the view stretched across the valley below. John took a deep breath, feeling the crisp air fill his lungs. "I haven't felt this at peace in years," he admitted quietly. Nayeli turned to him, her eyes soft and understanding. "Sometimes," she said gently, "we just need someone to share the quiet with." There was an unspoken understanding between them, a connection that neither rushed but both recognized. It was in the small gestures, her hand brushing against his as they passed tools, the way she smiled when he made a joke, the comfort of sitting together in silence. John realized that his heart, which had been closed off for so long, was opening again. He had forgotten the simple joy of companionship, the warmth of shared moments, the reassurance that someone cared not just for the work he did, but for who he was. Days turned into weeks, and spring approached slowly. The snow receded completely, leaving behind the rich scent of earth and the first shoots of new grass. John and Nayeli spent more time outdoors, planting gardens, repairing barns, and exploring the land together. Nayeli taught John about native plants and herbs, their uses in healing and cooking. John showed her how to handle cattle in different seasons, how to anticipate changes in weather, and the careful attention the land required to thrive. Each day their skills complemented one another, their trust growing stronger. One evening, after a particularly long day, they returned to the cabin to find the fire almost burned out. Nayeli set about tending the embers while John prepared a simple dinner. They ate quietly at first, savoring the warmth of the cabin and the comfort of home. Then, as the night grew darker, their conversation drifted to dreams and hopes. Nayeli spoke of places she still wanted to visit, of skills she wished to learn, and of the family she hoped to have one day. John listened, heart swelling, realizing that he too had dreams he had long buried, dreams that now felt possible again, with her by his side. It was during these quiet evenings that John began to notice subtle changes in himself. He laughed more easily, felt lighter even after hard days of work, and found that the loneliness that had once seemed permanent was beginning to fade. He cherished Nayeli's presence not because she filled the silence, but because she added meaning to it. Her curiosity, kindness, and gentle strength inspired him, reminding him that life could still hold surprises and joys even in the middle of winter and isolation. One afternoon they were working together to repair a section of fence damaged by a recent storm. Nayeli handed John a hammer, her fingers brushing his briefly. The contact was fleeting, but it sent a warmth through him that he could not ignore. He looked at her, and for a moment the work around them seemed to vanish. She smiled, as if sensing his thoughts, and their eyes met in a silent understanding. It was not love spoken aloud yet, but it was the first flicker of something deeper, a connection that neither could deny. As the days went on, John found himself thinking about Nayeli when she was not around. He realized that her presence had become a part of his daily life in a way that felt natural and necessary. He no longer felt the weight of solitude pressing down on him, and he began to imagine a future where she might stay permanently, not just as a helper or friend, but as someone who shared his life in a deeper, more meaningful way. Their bond was solidified one rainy evening when a sudden storm forced them to shelter in the cabin for hours. They cooked together, shared stories, and laughed despite the storm raging outside. As the fire crackled and the wind howled, John felt a warmth he had not known in years. Nayeli's presence made the cabin feel like a home again, a place where life was shared and the hardships of the outside world seemed lighter. By the time the first flowers of spring appeared along the edges of the ranch, John knew that something remarkable had happened. The loneliness that had defined his life for so long had been replaced by companionship, trust, and a growing sense of love. Nayeli had brought not just warmth to the cabin, but life to his heart. And though neither of them had yet spoken of the future in words, their shared glances, laughter, and quiet moments had spoken volumes. John realized that life, even in its quietest and most isolated corners, could still surprise him. The ranch, the land, and the animals had always been constants, but Nayeli had added something entirely new, a human connection that filled his days with meaning and his nights with hope. For the first time in decades, he felt that the quiet of the ranch was not a burden, but a blessing, made richer by the presence of someone who truly cared. As they stood together on the porch one evening, watching the sun set over the distant mountains, John took a deep breath and felt the weight of years of loneliness lift just a little more. Nayeli's hand brushed against his, not as a gesture of necessity, but as a natural extension of the bond they had formed. He looked at her and smiled, realizing that this connection, gentle, steady, and unspoken, was the beginning of something extraordinary. Winter had returned to the ranch, but this time it felt different. The snow lay thick and sparkling across the fields, yet the cabin was warm, full of life, laughter, and the subtle magic of companionship. John Thompson had faced many winters alone, but this one was unlike any other. The silence that once defined Christmas had been replaced by quiet conversation, shared meals, and the comforting presence of Nayeli, whose laughter now filled the spaces that had once echoed only with wind. That particular morning the sky was a pale silver, clouds heavy with fresh snow. John and Nayeli moved through the ranch together, checking the fences and feeding the cattle. Their movements were synchronized, the rhythm of their work almost effortless, shaped by weeks of shared labor and trust. Nayeli carried a small bundle of herbs she had collected, explaining their uses as John listened, fascinated by her knowledge and the care she brought to even the smallest details. As the sun rose higher, its rays glinting off the snow, John noticed how different everything felt. The ranch, once stark and isolated, seemed alive with possibility. The wind no longer seemed lonely. It carried the subtle sounds of life. Nayeli's voice calling out, the animals' soft murmurs, the quiet creak of the cabin as it settled under the snow. John realized, with a sense of awe, that his heart no longer felt heavy with solitude. Nayeli's presence had transformed not just the cabin, but his entire world. After their morning work, they returned to the cabin for lunch. Nayeli had prepared a simple meal of roasted vegetables and fresh bread, the aroma filling the small space with warmth. They sat together, enjoying the food and each other's company. The conversation was light, filled with gentle teasing and stories of past winters. John found himself laughing in a way he hadn't in years, feeling a lightness in his chest that made him almost forget the harsh cold outside. As the afternoon approached, a quiet stillness settled over the ranch. The snow outside glittered like diamonds under the pale light, and the world seemed hushed, as if holding its breath. John stepped outside, checking the fences one last time, when he noticed Nayeli approaching from the barn. She carried a small wooden box wrapped in simple cloth. Her eyes met his, and for a moment there was a look that spoke volumes, a mixture of hope, anticipation, and something deeper that John couldn't yet name. "John," she said softly, her voice carrying over the snow-covered fields, "I wanted to show you something." She held out the box, and he took it gently, feeling the warmth of her hands lingering on his. Inside was a small collection of stones and feathers, each carefully chosen and arranged. Nayeli explained that they were symbols of protection, love, and new beginnings in her culture. John listened, deeply moved, realizing how much thought and care she had put into this simple gesture. The day passed slowly, the hours filled with quiet moments by the fire, shared tea, and the occasional glance that lingered just a little too long. John couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to happen, though he didn't know what. Naeli's presence was comforting, but there was an energy in the air that made his heart race in a way he hadn't felt in decades. As evening fell, the sky turned soft shades of pink and orange, the snow reflecting the fading light. They stood together on the porch, watching the world transform under the winter sunset. John felt a nervous excitement, his hands brushing against Naeli's as they leaned on the railing. The silence between them was filled with unspoken words, and he realized how much he wanted to express the feelings that had been growing inside him. Naeli turned to him, her eyes shining in the soft light. "John," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "these past weeks I've never felt so at home, so safe and so happy. You've opened a part of my heart I thought I would keep closed forever." John's breath caught in his throat. He had felt the same way, yet hearing her speak it aloud made the truth undeniable. Before he could respond, Naeli stepped closer, reaching for his hands. "I don't want to wait any longer," she said. "I don't want to imagine my life without you. Please." She hesitated for a brief moment, her eyes searching his. Then, softly, she said, "Marry me." The words hung in the air, fragile yet powerful, filling the space between them with warmth and hope. John's mind raced. Years of loneliness, decades of quiet winter nights, the sorrow he had carried since losing his wife, it all seemed to vanish in that single, unexpected moment. He looked into Naeli's eyes, seeing not just love, but courage, trust, and a willingness to share her life with him. Tears welled in John's eyes, unbidden and unstoppable. He had never imagined that someone could step into his life so fully, so completely, and offer not just companionship, but love, trust, and partnership. He took her hands in his, feeling the warmth of her palms and the steady beat of her heart. "Yes," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The wind outside softened, the snow glistened in the fading light, and the ranch, their home, seemed to hold its breath in celebration. Naeli smiled, tears shining in her eyes, and pressed her forehead gently against his. John felt a joy he had thought was long gone, a sense of wholeness he had never known he could feel again. They spent the rest of the evening in quiet celebration. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, casting warm light across the room. They shared a simple meal, spoke of their hopes for the future, and held each other close. The loneliness that had defined John's life for so many years was gone, replaced by a deep, enduring connection that promised love, trust, and partnership. Over the next few days, the news of their engagement settled into the rhythm of the ranch. The animals continued their routines, the snow continued to fall and melt, and life went on as it always had. But now it carried a new energy, a promise of beginnings. John and Naeli were side by side, their partnership strengthened not just by love, but by the shared effort and care that defined their days. Evenings were spent planning for the future. They spoke of small celebrations, of ways to blend their traditions, and of how they wanted their life together to look. John found himself dreaming again, imagining a home filled with warmth, laughter, and perhaps even children in the years to come. Naeli, too, spoke with excitement and care, her ideas and vision intertwining with his in a natural, harmonious way. One night, as the snow fell gently outside and the fire burned low, John sat back in his chair, watching Naeli move about the cabin. The sight filled him with awe and gratitude. He had spent so many Christmases alone, yet here he was, on the same land he had always loved, with someone who loved and understood him. The thought brought tears to his eyes once more, tears of joy, relief, and profound happiness. He realized then that life had a way of surprising even the most solitary of hearts. The ranch, the animals, the snow, and the quiet winters had all been constants, but Naeli's presence had changed everything. She had brought life to the cabin, warmth to his heart, and hope to a future he had thought would always be lonely. As he held her close that night, John knew that their bond was more than companionship. It was a partnership, a friendship, and a love that had grown slowly, patiently, and naturally. The quiet of the ranch was no longer empty. It was filled with promise, trust, and the joy of shared life. And so, as the stars twinkled over the snow-covered fields and the firelight flickered across the cabin walls, John Thompson, the once lonely rancher, realized that he had found a love he never expected. Naeli's whisper had changed his world forever, and the winter that had once symbolized isolation now symbolized the beginning of a life filled with warmth, partnership, and hope. Spring returned to the ranch with a gentle promise of life and renewal. The snow had melted completely, revealing the rich, dark earth and tender green shoots pushing through the soil. Birds sang from the trees, their melodies drifting across the fields, and the sun warmed the land in a way that felt almost magical after the long winter. John Thompson and Naeli moved through the ranch together, their partnership now seamless, each understanding the other without needing words. Life was not just easier, it was fuller, brighter, and filled with hope. The cabin, once quiet and lonely, now echoed with laughter and conversation. Naeli had brought touches of her own culture into the home, small, handcrafted decorations, jars of dried herbs, and carefully chosen textiles that added color and warmth. John found joy in these small changes, delighting in the way her presence transformed the space. He would catch himself watching her, smiling at her quiet movements, her gentle care for the cabin and the animals, and the way her laughter could lift even the heaviest moments. Their days were busy with ranch work, but even in routine tasks they found joy together. They repaired fences, fed the cattle, tended to gardens, and mended tools, often working side by side in a rhythm that had grown natural and comforting. Naeli taught John new ways to care for the land, from identifying plants that could improve the soil to techniques for preserving food. John shared his own knowledge, showing her the secret trails he had discovered over the years and the spots where the cattle preferred to graze. Together they had built a partnership rooted in trust, respect, and shared purpose. As the days grew longer, neighbors and friends began to notice a change in John. The once reserved rancher now greeted visitors with a smile, speaking openly and warmly. The cabin, once a place of solitude, now hosted occasional gatherings, small dinners, and quiet celebrations. John realized that his life had expanded beyond the boundaries of the ranch itself. It was no longer just about survival and work, but about sharing joy, love, and connection. Naeli's influence had brought a sense of community back into his world. One afternoon, as the sun warmed the fields and the air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers, John and Naeli worked together in the garden. Naeli knelt in the soil, planting seeds carefully while John dug trenches for irrigation. They paused occasionally to sip water or admire the early growth of their plants. John found himself feeling lighter than he had in years, the weight of past loneliness replaced with the excitement of planning a life together. Naeli's presence had become indispensable, not as a helper but as a companion, a friend, and a partner in every sense. Evenings at the cabin had become moments of quiet celebration. They would sit by the fire, sometimes reading, sometimes sharing stories, sometimes simply enjoying the warmth and the soft glow of the flames. John had begun to cook occasionally, experimenting with recipes Naeli taught him, and they laughed at the small mistakes and celebrated the successes together. These nights were filled with a gentle rhythm of shared life, a rhythm that John realized he had longed for more than he knew. As spring turned to early summer, the couple began making plans for their future. They spoke of a wedding, not grand or elaborate, but meaningful and filled with traditions from both of their lives. John envisioned a ceremony on the ranch, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and the natural beauty that had defined his life. Naeli spoke of incorporating elements from her Apache heritage, weaving blessings, music, and stories into the celebration. They agreed on a day in early summer, when the fields were green and the air carried the warmth of the sun and the fragrance of blooming wildflowers. When the day of the wedding arrived, the ranch was bathed in sunlight, the air filled with the hum of bees and the songs of birds. Friends and neighbors had gathered, bringing dishes, decorations, and heartfelt congratulations. The cabin, usually quiet, buzzed with activity as preparations were made. John felt a nervous excitement he hadn't experienced since he was a young man. He glanced at Naeli, who was arranging flowers and weaving a simple garland for her hair, and felt a deep surge of love and gratitude. The ceremony was simple, but beautiful. They stood together in the garden, the sunlight filtering through the trees, and exchanged vows that reflected their shared journey, respect, and love. Naeli's eyes shone with joy, and John's heart felt full in a way he had thought impossible. As they held hands and promised to share their lives, there was a sense of completeness, a feeling that all the years of waiting, solitude, and hard work had led to this perfect moment. After the ceremony, they celebrated with a meal under the shade of a large oak tree. Laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses filled the air. Friends and neighbors shared stories, offered blessings, and danced in the sun. John and Naeli moved among the guests, their joy evident in every smile, every gentle touch, and every glance they exchanged. It was a day that marked not just the beginning of a marriage, but the continuation of a life that had been enriched by love, trust, and shared purpose. In the weeks that followed, John and Naeli settled into their married life on the ranch. Each day brought new challenges, but also new joys. They worked together, shared meals, explored the land, and cared for the animals with renewed energy. Their bond deepened with every sunrise and sunset, every storm weathered, and every quiet evening spent by the fire. The ranch, once a place of isolation, had become a home filled with love, laughter, and hope for the future. John often thought back to the lonely Christmases he had spent alone, the quiet nights when the wind outside seemed louder than the world within the cabin. He realized that those years of solitude had taught him resilience, patience, and the value of hard work. But it was Nayeli who had shown him that life could be more than survival. It could be shared, vibrant, and full of unexpected joy. Their love grew not only from shared responsibilities, but from small, meaningful moments. Nayeli would surprise John with a special tea she brewed, and he would prepare a favorite meal in return. They would sit together on the porch at sunset, watching the cattle graze and the mountains glow in the distance, sometimes speaking, sometimes sitting in contented silence. These were the moments that defined their life, simple yet profound. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a long day, John reflected on how much had changed. The ranch was no longer just a home. It was a place of love, connection, and shared purpose. Nayeli had transformed the quiet, lonely space into a vibrant home, and in doing so had transformed his life. He reached for her hand, feeling the warmth and comfort he had once thought impossible to find again. "I can't imagine my life without you," he said softly. Nayeli smiled, squeezing his hand gently, and replied, "And I won't let you have to." Spring and summer passed, and with each passing day, their life on the ranch became richer. The fields grew greener, the gardens flourished, and the animals thrived under their care. The cabin remained warm and inviting, filled with laughter, conversation, and the quiet magic of shared life. Friends visited more often, drawn not just by the beauty of the ranch, but by the evident happiness of the couple who had found each other against all odds. John and Nayeli often reflected on their journey together, amazed at how life had changed. What had begun as a lonely Christmas filled with quiet and sorrow had transformed into a life filled with love, hope, and partnership. They had discovered that even the most isolated hearts could find joy, that even the quietest winters could be transformed by connection, and that unexpected moments could bring profound change. As the sun set over the ranch one warm evening, John and Nayeli stood together on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. The land stretched before them, alive with possibility and promise. John took Nayeli's hand in his, feeling the steady warmth of her palm and the deep comfort of knowing they would face the future together. The ranch, once a place of solitude, had become a symbol of life, love, and the enduring power of human connection. For John Thompson, the lonely rancher who had once spent Christmases alone, the world had transformed. He had found love in the most unexpected way, hope in a time he had thought was long past, and a partner who would share the joys and challenges of life on the ranch. Nayeli's presence had brought warmth to his heart, life to his home, and meaning to his days. Together, they faced the future with courage, joy, and the quiet, steady happiness of two souls who had found each other against all odds. And so the ranch flourished, the seasons passed, and John and Nayeli built a life full of love, laughter, and shared dreams. The loneliness of the past was replaced with the promise of the future, and the quiet moments of winter gave way to a lifetime of warmth, companionship, and the joy of hearts united. Their story, born from solitude and strengthened by connection, became a testament to hope, resilience, and the power of love that arrives when it is least expected but most needed.